Welcome to Brookings for an exciting and topical conversation on how to create a better, more efficient approach to infrastructure. We're pleased to welcome Derek Kahn, the Undersecretary of Policy at the Department of Transportation. Will be addressed by Congressman Brian Babin, and we have a distinguished panel. But before you hear from them, I want to set the stage briefly. There's a broad consensus that America's infrastructure system, once a source of national pride and international competitive advantage, has decreased in quality and in certain areas fallen into a state of disrepair and disgrace. Look no further than today's cover front page of the Wall Street Journal: a pedestrian bridge collapsed, resulting in fatalities. That's just unacceptable. There are important debates regarding what to do about this, how much to spend, who should pay for it, what should be built, and who is responsible. American infrastructure is largely decentralized, with strong roles played by state and local governments, as well as the federal government and increasingly the private sector. These are a lot of tough questions, but let's put them aside for a second. Regardless of where you come out on these questions, there should be one position that's shared by everybody. Whatever amount of money is spent, infrastructure should be built more wisely. We should use our limited resources as efficiently and effectively as possible to produce the greatest returns on investment. Transforming these economic platitudes into actionable outcomes is more challenging than economists often assume. We like to just assume a simple cost-benefit analysis and everybody plug in the numbers. But the reality is that designing cost-benefit analyses within and across infrastructure modes is not straightforward. Infrastructure projects are often idiosyncratic, with unique challenges, constraints, and differing goals. The purpose of today's event is to bring together a diverse cross-section of policymakers, thought leaders, and professionals to delve into details and try to think through concrete solutions to enable infrastructure investment to achieve more of its potential and avoid wasteful mistakes. To lead us in that endeavor, I am very pleased to introduce Derek Kahn, Undersecretary of Transportation for Policy. In that role, he coordinates the department's budget and policy and generates proposals regarding legislative and regulatory initiatives across all modes of transportation. He's really the thought leader at the department, as well as the number 3 person in charge, and uniquely and importantly in charge of all modes of transportation. A leader in transportation prior to his appointment, Mr. Kahn was general manager of Lyft and served on the board of directors of Amtrak. No stranger to Washington, Derek served as chief economist to the Senate Republican Policy Committee, on the staff of the White House Office of Management and Budget, and as a policy advisor to Senator Leader Mitch McConnell, where Derek is really important, played a critical role in helping America address some of its major financial, economic, and at some level political crises going into the financial crisis in 2008. Derek is a graduate of the University of Southern California, the London School of Economics, and Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. Please join me in welcoming a friend, colleague, and a thought leader in transportation in one of the most important roles in government in Washington here, Derek Kahn.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you all for coming. It's great to see a lot of familiar faces, and looking at the panel that follows me, I looking forward to hearing folks like Tony talk about some of the great ideas that ASCE has and the grand challenge that they kicked off. Nick on some of the data analytics that Virginia's doing, and Cal on a lot of the things that the chemical industry is facing in terms of infrastructure. You're in for a great treat. Tara Jeffries has promised on her Twitter she can make anything sound interesting. So I'm looking forward to saying that. We're going to hold her to it. Infrastructure is always hard to talk about, in large part because there is the ASCE. And the ASCE, as everybody here knows, grades everything. So I'm sure everybody's thinking, is this panel, are these remarks going to be a D+, another D+, because that's all we've heard. So hopefully we talk about a number of important issues. I want to talk about 3 things today. First, I want to talk about the administration's priorities, and really Secretary Chow's priorities at the Department of Transportation. Number 2, I want to talk about infrastructure and what are the core reasons to the inefficient allocation of capital and construction we have in infrastructure today, and third, on the administration's proposal. The department is focused on three things. Secretary Chow laid out three key priorities for the department. One is safety. Safety must always come first in everything we do. Number two, rebuilding our nation's infrastructure. And number three, preparing for the future. That is, deploying and testing innovative technologies that can potentially leapfrog us to have a more competitive infrastructure system globally. Secretary Chow has a long history in the Department of Transportation and a deep understanding of these issues and really how to balance innovation and safety. It's something we spend a lot of time thinking about, and yesterday was just another sobering reminder that we need to balance safety with infrastructure and innovation. Now today I want to really focus on two more things: the core reason for inefficient infrastructure, and two, the administration's proposal. Everyone knows our country's infrastructure is aging and that there are challenges everywhere. We've all seen and read ASCE's grade of a D+, and some statistics recently are further sobering. From 1980 to 2008, VMT, vehicles mile traveled in this country, grew by about 95%, yet highway miles only grew 7.5%. The result of all of this is increased congestion, increased delays, and cost estimates of these delays range anywhere from $160 billion annually to $300 billion annually. To put that in perspective, that's like an additional tax of $500 or $1,000 out of every single American in this country today. The needs are even greater in rural America, where 19% of our country lives, but 50% of highway fatalities occur. And so you have this major mismatch and an acute problem that we're trying to solve. But if you think about it, these are all symptoms. And I want to spend some time talking about the core economic problem. Most public policy problems relate to market failures, and most market failures relate to externalities. And this is really the core challenge in infrastructure globally. The benefits are highly dispersed, but few will offer to pay. For instance, if a bridge is built on the other side of town and you save 25 cents a day because of a slightly faster commute, and packages come, a nickel a day, that comes out to maybe 30 cents a day or $100 a year. Well, if you received a $120 bill at the end of the year to build a bridge across the city, nobody would want to pay it. So you have this problem where there are slight marginal benefits to a very broad base of users. And now we have a hard time figuring out how do you really allocate costs. And that's where the federal government has long played a role. If a project couldn't get funding because of this externalities issue, it would simply turn to the federal government. But today we have somewhere between a $2 to $4 trillion gap in infrastructure spend over the next 10 years. And I think ASCE estimates that we have a $5.2 trillion gap by 2040 unless we change the trajectory. That's what Cal's talked about in some of his, Tony's talked about in some of his remarks. If you look at our nation's infrastructure, the vast bulk of infrastructure spending and ownership in the United States is non-federal. So the administration has developed a long-term solution to our nation's infrastructure problem that rests on strong federal, state, local, and private partnerships. Providing more federal funding on its own is not the solution to our infrastructure challenges, as history has shown that when taxpayer dollars are sent to Washington, they're oftentimes inefficiently invested. And DC doesn't solve this externality problem much better than anybody else. And so the administration is proposing offering these additional funds in a manner that will stretch the use and the benefit of taxpayer dollars. So how do we solve this free rider problem and build a more efficient infrastructure? President Trump's infrastructure plan is based upon a few core principles. Number one, stimulate infrastructure investment. Number two, invest in rural America. Number three, increase state and local authorities and push down decision-making to state and local leaders. Number four, eliminate regulatory barriers. And number five, streamline permitting. Under stimulating infrastructure investment, the President's proposal does four things. First, a new incentives program is created. This would encourage state, local, and private investment by awarding project sponsors incentives for demonstrating innovative approaches that will generate independent revenue, reduce project costs and timelines, and improve performance. The incentives program would target a wide range of traditional government-owned assets, ranging from roads to airports to rails, ports, waterways, and many others. Sponsors would apply for incentives, and they'd be evaluated on an objective criteria, with new revenue being the largest driver for the award, and things like updated procurement policies and innovative project delivery processes as other components of the criteria. As I mentioned earlier, rural America has unique infrastructure challenges, particularly because of this free rider externalities challenge. The President's plan would seek to rebuild and modernize bridges, roads, waste and wastewater assets, power gen assets, and broadband through the Rural Infrastructure Program. The bulk of these funds would be provided to governors through a formula to choose the investments that respond to their unique needs. States could then apply for the remaining funds, which would be distributed on a performance-based grant basis. A third component of the infrastructure incentive is the Transformative Projects Program. President's plan includes a focus on transformative projects that can reimagine the traditional approaches to infrastructure and unlock GDP growth. The Transformative Projects Plan would spur competition around bold, innovative, and truly transformative projects that could dramatically improve future infrastructure, become self-sustaining without federal support, and had a significant impact on the nation, a region, state, or metropolitan area. The plan would also expand existing financing programs to address a broad range of infrastructure needs, giving state and local leaders increased opportunity to finance large-scale projects. States like Virginia have used the TIFIA program, which is a loan program administered at the Department of Transportation. And the proposal we put forward does things like expand TIFIA eligibility, increase funding for it, also increasing the funding for RIF and broadening its eligibility as well. So at the end of the day, the President's proposal can be summarized as doing two big things: creating more tools and incentives to help address this externalities problem, and two, returning decision-making back to the states. Now, it's always fun to come to Brookings and have an idea, a proposal criticized, analyzed, and debated. So I want to spend some time talking about a paper that Aaron wrote 3 years ago and analyze, criticize, and debate his paper. Just kidding, Aaron, I'm not going to debate all of it. His paper laid out 7 ideas, ranging from expanding TIFIA to creating better incentives, to encouraging better procurement, to leveraging new technologies, really around user fee collection. And frankly, many of the principles and ideas in the President's package are similar to that Brookings paper around procurement, innovation, and finance. Put another way, there's a lot of agreement on some of the policy solutions, most notably increased funding and expanding the eligibility for TIFIA, and 2, promoting more ways to collect revenue. Also, Aaron's paper did a very good job of highlighting new technologies and its potential to address infrastructure issues. We believe new technologies are changing transportation. For centuries, literally centuries, the way we addressed transportation and congestion challenges is spending millions and billions to build longer, wider, and more roads and bridges. But today, technology is disrupting transportation in a different way and giving us a new tool to attack it. Everyone in this room is carrying a GPS device. Everyone in this room is carrying probably 2 cameras in their pocket. Now, if you think about it, if this data was collected, was aggregated, and was mined, a policymaker could monitor and identify traffic choke points. This is actually something that's not idealistic gas or some futuristic idea. This is something that the state of Virginia is actually starting to do, that using data to better predict and identify traffic choke points around a state. Now, the data we have and the technology we have is truly unprecedented. And this administration also believes that technology has the potential to move us toward a more efficient system. So let me conclude by saying the problem of infrastructure is an age-old problem. Externalities is the classic public policy problem. This administration believes strongly that creating more tools, incentivizing the right behavior, and pushing more decision rights to the states will move us toward having a better, more efficient transportation system. Thank you very much for hosting us, Aaron, and I'm happy to take any questions.
So, Derek, thank you for those wise remarks, which really lay out a coherent narrative for the president's proposal, which, as you point out, shares a lot of common ground. And I think you guys deserve a lot of credit. There's much in that proposal I could imagine coming out in any administration. And, you know, people's perspectives differ, but I think on infrastructure, it's one in which there's far more common ground than most other issues. Let's move forward on the president's proposal and imagine a world in which the administration's proposal is enacted by Congress, and you get to implement this. You talked about two different buckets of innovative projects, a first one and a third one that's transformative. Can you be a little more specific? What kind of innovative projects you imagine being the first to get these grants, to have the local match, and to begin to break ground?
Three ideas come to mind, and we're seeing technology disrupt all forms of transportation, which is so exciting. One, where we're starting to see it internationally, is the use of self-driving trucks for specific manufacturing and mining processes. In South America, one company is using self-driving mining trucks to move resources 24/7. So one area where I could see which states will need additional capital is to create something like a self-driving dedicated trucking lane. This not only allows us to de-risk self-driving trucks, but it also allows us to demonstrate technology. And by having a dedicated lane, you then allow for risk of less accidents, because if a self-driving truck runs into a barrier, nobody is really injured. And so we have the ability now, the technology exists. You have states that want to do it. So I could see an early project being with some of the transformative money and some of the infrastructure incentives money going to a state that says we have a partner where we'd like to demonstrate a new technology such as self-driving trucking. We have an area that connects a manufacturing hub with a freight airport, and we want to create a channel that allows the self-driving truck to move back and forth 24/7. That's one. I think a second, which a lot of folks have heard about, is Hyperloop. Hyperloop's now been around where it is a high-speed transmission of either people or goods underground, subterranean, and it could move hundreds of miles an hour. Hyperloop is ready to break ground. They're looking at getting more permits. And so we're already seeing these kinds of concepts being tested and deployed around the world. I think that could be a second area to get some of the first grants and have local match. And the third, which is even a little further out there, is commercial space travel. This is probably 10 or 15 years down the road. But traveling from LA to New York, DC to LA is a beast. And any of us that have done it, it takes 5.5, 6 hours and 2 hours in TSA. What if you can fly a space shuttle to take 30 minutes to go to the launch pad, and it would literally launch from Los Angeles and land at somewhere like in New York or Washington, D.C. And so this is a third area where this is not science fiction anymore. There are companies that are testing technologies, that have raised funding, that are actually creating products, that are taking research papers and actually commercializing it. So these are three areas where I see very near-term application: dedicated trucking, Hyperloop, and commercial space.
So let me delve on that. I think it's fascinating. One thing, you made a great point talking about centuries-old issues. I was doing a book review on infrastructure for foreign affairs, and it's not well known that in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, when subway technology was a new technology, the competing technology was Hyperloop. It was actually dedicated kind of airless tubes, kind of like the bank tubes that we see as being the ultimate outcome of that technology. And they built a 1.5 city block Hyperloop in New York City in 1870. It ultimately lost to the rail technology. This was around the time of the early subways. So it feels to me like we're a little bit on the verge of a tipping point where new technology threatens massive disruption. And when we're talking about investment, I'm always reminded that canals were a great investment in 1820, and you could really go belly up building a canal in 1848, right before the railroads come through, right? So where can we The second question here is, are ride-sharing companies reducing demand for public transit? Are drones and new delivery mechanisms going to disrupt trucking? You were part of the disruptive wave of thinking at Lyft before coming to the administration. How are you incorporating that thinking into DOT's infrastructure agenda?
A lot of exciting questions. Thank you. You do me, I do you.
Great.
It feels like it does feel like we are on the verge of a tipping point. There are so many new technologies, so many new ideas. Your first question is, could driverless cars remove the need for parking? If you think about it, the fascinating thing about ride-sharing companies and autonomous is it actually begins to align resources. And think about it. It took us about 25 minutes to go 2.5 miles across town today. Now, I wish nobody else had to drive during this time, but I have no way of impacting those other people. It's an externalities issue. All of us need to get somewhere, and we create a slightly worse public good because we need to get somewhere, but those costs aren't really borne by all. And so what is a good way to share costs? Well, one way is to have business models that care a lot about this. And today, you actually have ride-sharing companies that care a lot about congestion. And so, whereas getting off the freeway and taking a side road may help me, unclear if it helps others, and that dynamic actually exists now with companies like Uber that think through how do we deal with congestion and how do we map traffic and how do we route and dispatch correctly. And so driverless cars, really the business model comes around utilization. And how do you utilize a car perpetually? If you are utilizing a car perpetually, you do need less street parking. However, you may need more urban lanes, and you may cause more congestion. But at the same time, you have a very positive feedback loop because ride-sharing and self-driving will seek to avoid congestion. And so for the first time, frankly, in history, we not only have the problem pretty well articulated, which is externality, public goods, free rider problems, but you have technology that allows us to start collecting the data and actually making some significant change. You talked about if ride-sharing companies are what they're doing to other modes of transportation. It's interesting. We're seeing that new technologies such as ride-sharing actually have puts and takes. On one hand, ride-sharing is a great first and last mile enabler. So people will take ride-share to a local transit station and then jump on a metro. But at the same time, as ride-sharing cost comes down, in some ways it replaces it. So the jury is still mixed if it has a net improvement or harm in terms of demand for transit. What we do know is it is changing the passenger demographic of transit and the nature of transit. Finally, you talked about the disruptive wave of thinking at Lyft. At the Department of Transportation, we launched a new initiative about 6 months ago called the Safety Data Initiative. There is so much data in the world. We are awash in data. Frankly, there are so many recorders, video cameras. There are so much data, frankly, in this room right now that blow your mind. To put it in context, the phone that each of us carry in our pocket has more processing power than all of NASA had when they launched the Apollo mission. Put another way, there is more data in your pocket than all of the movies produced in 1920. You have more storage space in your pocket than all movies produced in 1920. And so what does this mean for us? As transportation professionals, it gives us a great opportunity. And so we've begun with the Safety Data Initiative to do three things. One, bringing visualization tools. Number two, integrating existing databases. And three, preparing for artificial intelligence. Now, if a city or a state could capture all the information around transportation, around accidents, congestion, visualize it in a more compelling way, and begin to integrate data sources. Think of the public good we could do. Think of how we could identify specific choke points, identify high-risk areas, and really change the number of fatal accidents that we have every year in America.
So, to go back, we've gone in depth on the third bucket about transformative. When we get back to the first bucket of projects, you discuss things that bring in new revenue. And I like how you framed the externalities issue in the paper you referenced. We talked a lot about thinking beyond user fees to beneficiary fees. There are lots of people who benefit from infrastructure who may never actually use it. Think of the landowner right next to the train station or highway stop. They may never have to get on that road or take that train, but their property value has shown a giant benefit. You also mentioned innovative procurement. Ideas in that paper involve pool procurement or dig once, coordinating infrastructure modes. Congressman Babin has an idea, who we'll hear from later, regarding open materials and better types of contracting that allow for more competition to reduce cost. How is the administration going to think through weighting these, incentivizing these, communicating with states and localities, sharing ideas, so that, one of the things I noticed in the some of the earlier administration ideas that have been implemented about competitive grants is, even if you don't get the grant, if you see somebody do something smarter, you incorporate that into your own mode of thinking. So walk through some of these ideas, pick any and all, and provide a little clarity about how you would think about implementing this proposal.
There's a ton of very specific ideas we have in our infrastructure proposal. The infrastructure incentives title has 6 criteria, the biggest of which is leverage, sort of new revenue to the table. But a second important component is innovative procurement policies. And I know you've written on pooled procurement. And that's a great example of using new ways to deliver projects more efficiently. The president in August signed a memorandum directing agencies to start thinking about one federal decision. We have a pretty crazy, convoluted way in which we get permits. And it really has to stop. We have agencies that oftentimes try to create a very similar document called a record of decision. And this record of decision is created by multiple agencies doing very slightly different things, but really with the same intent. And so one of the big core drivers between one federal decision is, instead of having all of these different agencies sequentially pull information and process information, let's create a single record. And let's have a single agency, and actually let's do these things in parallel instead of sequentially. Another area that you talked about is dig once, which is another great common sense example. If a state decides to tear up a road to lay broadband, and then they also separately, another agency, want to tear up a road to lay new transmission or duct and trench work for a transmission line. Well, if they're digging up the same road at a pretty similar time in the same construction season, I have an idea. Why don't we dig once? That's a second example of just basic things that the federal government really hasn't driven and encouraged states to do. At the same time, there's a lot of sort of informal cultural work that needs to get done, which is better sharing of best practices. I think there's been a long history of states being sort of sheepish in and the federal government sheepish in acknowledging mistakes we've made in procurement and project delivery, when a project is either late or on time, or either late or cost overruns. Most folks don't really do a postmortem about what happened. And I think we need a cultural shift to say it's okay if projects are over, cost overruns or delayed, but let's try to figure out exactly why, and let's create best practices and ways in which we can learn and create a more powerful feedback loop across cities and states.
I think that's excellent. I'd turn to the audience and let's engage. When I was in the administration, I actually encouraged that we would put out not just a best practices list, but a worst practices, biggest mistakes. Now, I was in the first term of the administration, the prior administration, like you, and there was some reticence to call out states and localities that had made giant mistakes. I often wonder if that might have been different in the second term. But I do think that, particularly as states would acknowledge and localities acknowledge their mistakes. I live in Montgomery County, Maryland, and there was an unmitigated debacle in building a transit center. And, the county needs to get beyond that and acknowledge their giant mistake that cost taxpayers millions of dollars. But there is a reticence to do that. I think Senator Coburn did a good job of calling us out and on that, which is hard for me to swallow and say as a Marylander. But I do think that's a role at some level the federal government can play. I see some folks in the audience. We have some mic runners who wants to raise their hand and kick us off. You guys didn't all come here. Here we go. I was going to say, everybody came here to talk infrastructure. It's usually not a shy crowd. Exciting is a different word, but we're not shy. Sir, if you could just introduce yourself, and this is Jeopardy, so please in the form of a question.
Sure. Hi there. My name's Ott Tamek. I work at an infrastructure finance publication called Inspiration. I was just wondering if, from the federal funding side of what's been proposed in the administration's plan, I understand it's roughly around $20 billion a year for around 10 years. Could you kind of put that into context in how big that really is? And I appreciate, that, you can leverage debt and so on, but you're not going to use that to leverage debt for all situations. You've also talked about state funding and so on. So, thanks.
Great. The question was around federal funding, contextualized $200 billion, and how leverage doesn't. How would we really be able to lever that up? I very much agree that leverage concept applies most powerfully to debt. That with TIFIA, every dollar the federal government appropriates to TIFIA results in roughly $40 more in infrastructure financing. And I completely agree with the premise of the question that this alone isn't enough. To contextualize 1.5 trillion is pretty difficult, but one way to do that is looking at some of the macro estimates that the American Society of Civil Engineers have put out. They say that there's a $2 to $4 trillion backlog. I think their most recent numbers is a $2 trillion backlog. An infrastructure funding gap is what they call it over the next decade. And while $1.5 trillion won't solve it all, it does help take a big bite out of the infrastructure financing gap. Now, if you think about sort of the challenges of deployment of capital, oftentimes capital is deployed on the margin. That if you could get 9% return versus 7% return, you shift your portfolio. And this isn't sort of for a personal investment account. This is actually how mutual funds, endowments, insurance companies think about resources. And so the infrastructure incentives plan seeks to encourage and incentivize more funding from states, local, and private sector to bring that funding to the table. Also, states oftentimes are very reticent to raise user fees. We see some cities taking a great approach, leading by having a very broad-based tax. For instance, Measure M in Los Angeles, 0.5 cent tax on all sales for all citizens in the county. Now this results in billions of dollars. Now, what our plan does is if a state goes out and sets a broad-based infrastructure dedicated user fee and raises $10 billion a year, our plan would say in year one you qualify for a $2 billion check, provided you hit the other things, but you get 20% of all of the revenue you raise over the lifetime of that revenue. And so you not only create an incentive, but you also create a very powerful timing shift. So for a city that says, is it really worth raising $10 billion over 10 years, where I get $1 billion a year for 10 years, we're saying, yes, that all happens, and you get $2 billion in year one. So a lot of numbers there, but in short, what the incentives program does is it tries to increase incentives on the margin, because that's where allocation decisions are made. And by encouraging states to enact laws, to review their existing assets, we hope that states and localities are able to bring more resources to the table. One final note. New York a few years ago was asked to conduct an inventory of all of their assets. New York City. They found that they had 1,100 assets in the city of New York. Now, if they wanted to sell some of those assets, we would then provide a 20% kicker to the revenue they raise from the divestiture of those assets or leasing out, creating a long-term lease of those assets. Now, these are pretty common sense questions and pretty common sense solutions that let's create policies that simply incentivize more financing and investing on the margin, because you actually see pretty significant returns in that way.
Yeah, it's amazing what infrastructure organizations at the state and local level have accumulated in assets over hundreds of years of their lifetime. You know, if they were a family, they'd have a garage sale. You know, I've never met a family that's broke and has a bunch of valuable stuff in their attic. I think there was one family just now that found a $3 million baseball card that had been in their attic. You know, believe it or not, I would posit that out of all the state and local infrastructure, there's some of them sitting on real money while they're pointing out giant operating debts. We have time for the fastest question there is in the room. So you raise your hand quickly. Please speak very quickly and very brief question, because we got to get you out of here and get up.
Rick Ryback with Just Economics. Thank you for the presentation. Aaron, you mentioned the importance of beneficiary fees and the fact that landowners get a huge benefit from infrastructure. Today, most of that benefit is a pure windfall, and that's the fuel for land speculation, which is a parasitic activity which disrupts land use, makes infrastructure inefficient, forces sprawl. I was very intrigued in the administration's infrastructure plan, in the transit section. You require transit projects to use land value capture financing as a condition for getting federal grants. And I'm wondering, why only transit? Roads, water and sewer, all infrastructure creates land value uplift. It creates efficiency, both it ties infrastructure to land use. I was wondering if the administration would extend that requirement to other infrastructure projects.
It's a very good question. Land value capture seems to make the most sense around transit because that's where most of the research has been done. That there's been a lot of research that says what happens when you build a new metro station or you have transit on demand development around a transit station, what happens to property values. So there is just a large body of literature around what happens to a specific community and neighborhood when you invest in transit. But we're not wedded to not having transit as part of it. And this is sort of the greatest thing about the infrastructure package is the ideas at the end of the day are pretty bipartisan. And there's actually a lot of agreement. And so if folks believe that there should be value capture in a broader array of assets, that's something that we would be very open to hearing and talking more about. So it is not anything that we feel firmly that it should only apply to transit, but rather there's an openness on a whole range of issues. At the end of the day, the question is, how do we increase infrastructure finance and investment? And that can come from any shapes and sizes, and we are very much looking forward to having this discussion with the Hill.
Great. Well, can everybody join me in thanking Undersecretary Khan for his time and his wise remarks? Thank you very much.